Hello, this is the last third and final paper preparation video I'm going to do, and this is the big one because this is the pre-release. This is the one that tests you on all your knowledge over the last 2 years. Hopefully it's not going to be too long, but there is quite a lot to cover because there's 5 research bullet points and the structure of the paper is a little bit different. So I'll try and give you as much information as I possibly can, but it might take 2 watches. So starting point is going to be what's the difference between paper 3 and paper 1 and 2. The most obvious difference is there's no 4 markers on this paper, so there's an 8 marker instead. So section A has an 8 marker, a 10 marker, a 12 marker and a 20 marker, and section B is the same. You want to again try and spend a mark a minute, giving you 10 minutes spare in each section. You want to try and split it into 2 sections in 2 hours, so try and make sure that by the time you've got to the end of hour 1, you're about to start section B. Otherwise you're going to find it difficult, because obviously from a timing perspective this one's more challenging because you've got an 8 marker, you've got another essay question, and there's no straightforward calculations where if you know the calculation it shouldn't take 4 minutes to save you a little bit of time. So just make sure that you're really conscious of that. Make sure you know what to expect going in. Know that you're going to get 8 essay questions. Obviously some of them are short, an 8 marker only requires 2 paragraphs, but make sure you're prepared for that because it is a lot of writing, it is hard work, but it is the last A-level business paper that you're going to do. So just make sure you leave everything in there. So as always, you're given 2 sets of extracts, 1 for each section. So again, consider how you'd approach the case studies. I would suggest that you look at the questions and try and figure out which extract and section is likely to be for that question. The one big difference between paper 3 and paper 2, aside from the 8 marker instead of the 4 markers, is that you know what this one's going to be about. So there's a pre-release. I'll come to the pre-release in a minute, but there is a pre-release and it's all about the global confectionery market. So it's all about chocolate. So hopefully, my guys have done a lot of research on this, so we should have a pretty good understanding of the chocolate market and the sort of the key points. But that's what this video is basically going to cover as well. So we have an 8 marker instead of 2 4 markers. So we need to make sure we know how to answer an 8 marker when one comes up. And the first thing to start with would be an 8 marker doesn't require a conclusion. So an 8 marker is going to look something like assess to. And that could be assess to of anything. It could be assess to benefits, assess to consequences, assess to factors, assess to reasons, anything like that. But it's definitely going to be assess to. And so there's no judgment required, there's no conclusion required. You just need to write 2 paragraphs about whatever the question's asking you for. So if it's assess to benefits of something, you need to make sure that paragraph 1 is a peach paragraph about one benefit. The second paragraph needs to also be a benefit. Now, the weird thing with this is you can get a question that says assess 2 benefits. So you would think, based on the question, that all you have to do is assess the 2 benefits. But in order to get high marks, in order to get the high level 3 marks, you need to make sure that your answer has balance, which is kind of why when I wrote the peach paragraph structure, it's why the however bit came in. Because even a paragraph about a benefit has to have a however that considers maybe the other side of the argument as well. So a benefit might have a drawback. And so that however, and it doesn't need to be long, it just needs to be a sentence, will provide balance to your argument. So paragraph 1, and maybe it's a factor, that could be a positive factor or a negative factor, or a big factor or a small factor, needs to have a however. It needs to have something else that shows maybe why it's not so much of a factor. So it's straightforward, no conclusion necessary. You just need to you just assess your two factors, your 2 reasons, or whatever it is. The 10 marker and 12 markers, there's been a bit of discussion about this over the last few days. I've had quite a few messages from teachers around the country who've watched the videos, which is quite weird for me because, to be honest, I made them for my students to hear my main messages before they go into the exam. So it makes me laugh a little bit that people from outside of Ipswich seem to be watching them, but all right. It's quite nice actually. But I've had a few emails and a few messages about the difference between a 10 marker and a 12 marker, and I've told my students all along to answer a 10 marker in the same way you'd answer a 12 marker, and you'll just be awarded more marks for the sort of analysis and the evaluation side of the 12 marker to show how level 3 and level 4 are worth a little bit more marks. Because that was the case last year. Last year in the mark scheme, the mark band descriptors like what tells you what is a level 4 answer in a 10 marker or a 12 marker was exactly the same. It's word for word. There's a few people have sort of said that they're trying to make it a little bit more distinguished, and so in a 10 marker you actually require a little bit less. So I was told, and from fairly reliable sources, and I checked it out with a few people as well, that what you really need in the 10 marker is you need one paragraph sort of for your argument and one paragraph against your argument. So really what you really need is one peach paragraph, but the however would be its own peach paragraph, if that makes sense. So you don't need one peach paragraph with a balance to that first paragraph and then an entirely separate one. The balance to that first paragraph, providing it's in enough depth, would qualify as the second paragraph, and then you have a conclusion. I think that makes sense. To be honest though, my personal advice would be, and this is what I would say to my students, is if you've been doing it the way I've told you how to do it for the last 2 years, if anything, you're doing more than you required. So if you're all right with that from a timing perspective, I would just go with that. I would just do what you've usually been doing, and I wouldn't worry about how ultimately if you've made good points, if you've got a little bit more balance than you need, that's no bad thing. So I would just, if for my students, I would just stick to what you're doing. 12 marker is the same. We've got that peach paragraph, one peach paragraph for paragraph 1, one for paragraph 2. Obviously both of these need conclusions. Make sure you've got a conclusion in both of these. You don't really fully answer the question unless you've got a conclusion, so make sure you've got one. Again, they're going to look fairly similar. It's going to be something like assess weather, assess the likely impact of, assess the reasons, assess the importance of. So just make sure you're prepared to make sure your argument's balanced, is what I'm trying to say. Make sure it's balanced, but also make sure you've got the fundamentals. Make sure you've made points that are relevant to the question, and I've always suggested that students try and use the words of the question in your first sentence and in your conclusion to make sure that that's clear, and make sure that you've applied to the case study. That's obviously the other big one. You should know enough about this market as well to be able to bring in your own information. You don't need to quote statistics and so on if you don't know statistics, but like key market messages, knowing whether a market is growing or knowing maybe some context about competition and things like that. If you think it's relevant to your answer, bring it in, but you don't need to. You are able to get an A star using just the extracts that are given to you on the day. That being said, you should have done some research, so you should be able to. So you may as well use it. That's what you've done it for. And then obviously the 20 marker, I think the structure is fairly straightforward for the 20 marker. For and against option 1, for and against option 2, and then a conclusion with a recommendation. And remember, if you don't write the recommendation, if you don't actually recommend one of the options, you're not answering the question. So under no circumstances should you leave that exam room without having made a recommendation on both of your 20 markers. Now, there's no 4 marker here, so we know that we're going to be assessed on our quantitative data in another way. Last year, that was the last 20 marker. I would expect that's probably going to be the same as well. It might not be the only question. It might be the last 20 marker and then maybe one of the 10 or 12 markers. So make sure you're prepared for that. It wouldn't surprise me to see an investment appraisal bit on that last 20 marker or one of the 20 markers. So make sure you're clued up on payback period, average rate of return, net present value. My students, we did this on Monday, period 3. We did this before the paper 2 exam, thinking it might come up then. It didn't. But I would have another look at it before next Monday. So obviously it's Monday morning, so you won't see me before. Well, you can if you want. You can come in at about 8 o'clock. I'll be around if you want to have some last minute inspirational speeches thrown your way. But I would have a look at you've got your numerical practice booklets and stuff like that. So have a look at, you've got 10 examples of payback period and 10 examples of average rate of return and net present value. Make sure you know how to do those calculations and make sure you know how to do them quickly, because obviously timing's going to be tight and you don't want to spend 15 minutes of your 20 minutes for your 20 marker working out the calculations. That being said, once you've worked out your calculations or your numerical data that you're going to use in your paragraphs and your answers, that's not the only point you should make, but it should make writing the paragraphs much, much easier. So what you would likely see in one of those questions is the key thing with data is you should have a frame of reference to compare it to. And so if it's investment appraisal, for example, or if it's ratio analysis, or if it's anything else, any other calculations, you should be given some numbers to compare it to. So if maybe that's profit margins, you'd have some profit margins to compare it to. If it's investment appraisal, like payback period, they would give you maybe the payback period and the average rate of return for one of the options, and you would have to calculate it for the other option, and then obviously you compare it. And obviously you want a higher average rate of return because it suggests that your average profit from the project as a percentage of your initial investment is higher. Obviously profit, we always want profitability to be higher. And we want our payback period to be shorter because that means that we're recouping the cost of the investment quicker. So just make sure you're aware of what payback period is, what net present value is, what average rate of return is, and make sure you're comfortable doing those calculations. But not only that, make sure you're comfortable understanding the things, the numbers you get from the calculations as well. Obviously, that's just as important because you're not going to be able to make a very strong argument if you don't understand the figures. So we've got this pre-release content. This is what the exam board gives us at the start. We get it in about November or so. So we should have you've had this for a while. They say this year the context is the market for chocolate confectionery and the private businesses operating in this market in the UK and or internationally. Obviously, there's going to be an international flavour to it because Theme 4 is entirely about global business. So there's obviously going to be some global companies here. So to prepare for this year's context, you should research these 5 bullet points. I'm not going to go through them very much here because I'm going to go through them on the next slide, and it's pretty much these 5 bullet points that I'm going to go through in some detail over the rest of this presentation. The one thing to remember is you can't take any of your research or investigation data into the exam, obviously, but if you've been studying it for long enough, you should know some of it. Some of it hopefully stayed in your mind. So you should have a bit of information to take in there with you. Obviously, you still get extracts and case studies and stuff like that. So you should still have enough information to work with from those. But obviously, if you already know, the questions are going to be based around these 5 bullet points as well. So you should expect maybe to see a question about things like the trend in the number and size of manufacturers. There's a lot. We'll talk about this in a little while, but there's like examples of growth and in takeovers. There's quite a lot of takeovers. Social trends with influences, human resources, the competitive environment. You should get questions on those things because that's why those bullet points were written, and I would assume that the questions have been written based on those bullet points as well. So before I go into any more detail, I do have to thank a few people or a few websites and sources where I got the information that I've used. Because I've obviously taught this stuff over the last 6 months to 7 months, and I've used the resources available to me to do so. So I've used some of the stats and figures. I've not used many figures, but some of the ideas that I've got have come from these 3 sources. So I think it's worth paying credit to them because I haven't done all of this research. Obviously, as a teacher, I haven't got the time to do all the market data for the chocolate market. So the 3 main places I've got this information are Business Review magazine, which your teachers might get anyway, but it's really useful. There was a great article in one of them. I think it was the most recent one I think it was April's, about chocolate, which me and my students looked at in quite a lot of detail. Had loads of information, especially about things like the supply chain and the ethics of it all, and the human resources and stuff like that. Tutor to You provides every year. This is my 5th year teaching, and every single year I've bought their the pre-release companion that sort of gives loads of information, which is a bit of a lifesaver for teachers. So quite a lot of this information has come from Tutor to You, who are, without a doubt the best website for business studies revision. Certainly if you're looking for last minute videos on like different theories and stuff, and calculations, investment appraisal stuff's all on there. Have a look on Tutor to You. If you probably already are anyway, I would imagine. But they're really, really helpful. They published the Peach Paragraph thing when I first came up with it a couple of years ago. So that was on there. So they were really helpful to me with that. And then they came up with their own one anyway. But never mind. And Mintel. So I think Tutor to You worked with Mintel to produce a report. And there's quite a lot of obviously valuable information in there. Maybe your teachers have it, so maybe they'll share it with you. If not, I'm sure it's not too late to go on to Tutor to You's website and buy it. I'm sure they'll be happy to receive the revenue. So we're going to look through these 5 bullet points. Trends in the number and size of manufacturers. We're going to look at the different companies that dominate the mass market and some examples of mergers and takeovers. Influences on the market, so this would be for emerging economies and the more established developed economies. Some social trends, some CSR stuff. Human resources, so like ethics in the supply chain basically. So looking at there's a lot of the productions done away from the UK, certainly like the sourcing of raw materials and cocoa and stuff like that. And there's a lot of ethical considerations when it comes to human resources there. The competitive environment, especially the difference between a mass market and a niche market for this, because it's very, very, the competitive environment for both the mass market and the niche market are very, very different. And then a little bit at the end about marketing, promotion, and how these businesses market their products. So we're going to start with trends in the number and size of manufacturers. So the global chocolate market is dominated by 4 big firms. Mondelez from the US. I have no idea if I've been saying that right all year, but I'm gonna go with that. Which it used to be Kraft. I'll talk a little bit about that in a minute. It's on my next slide. Mars, we'll all have heard of, and I'd like to think I'm saying Mars correctly. Nestle, it's from Switzerland, and Ferrero from Italy. So between these 4 companies, the most recent data I saw was that they held 54% of the global market. And it would be significantly higher if it wasn't for Hershey's dominance of the US market. So I saw there was a pretty nice table I saw somewhere that talked about the different countries and how they all have their own particular, what they would consider to be the taste of chocolate. And I think in the UK, we would consider Cadbury's to be the standard of chocolate. Like if you asked me what chocolate tasted like, I would probably describe Cadbury's. I don't know how I'd describe it actually, but I would probably say, yeah, it just tastes like Cadbury's to me. That's what chocolate is, because it's probably the one that we were most, we saw the most when we were growing up. Now in America, obviously Hershey's is the big one. And so I think if you include Hershey's, it's something like 63% of the global market. So a lot of the business, especially in the mass market, is by these 4 companies. And one of the reasons for this is because over the last sort of 15 years, these companies have kind of swallowed up a lot of the smaller companies that have started to be successful. So there's been quite a lot of mergers and takeovers. It wouldn't surprise me at all to see some of these as examples in some of the extracts. So just make sure you don't need to know the dates, you don't need to know the amounts and stuff like that. If one's in the extract, that'll give you the relevant information, but it's worth having a little bit of a look at some of the examples. This isn't an exhaustive list, but these are some highlights. Cadbury took over Green and Blacks in 2005. That cost £20 million, roughly £20 million. Depends on where you find your figures, they tend to change. Green and Blacks are an organic chocolate manufacturer, so they started to try and go into the organic chocolate market a little bit then. And then Kraft took over Cadbury's in 2010 for £11.5 billion, roughly. So that's obviously a massive, massive takeover. Kraft Foods split 2 years later, and the new chocolate division, or the new division of Kraft that looked after Cadbury's, was named Mondelez. So Kraft did other things as well. They split it because they weren't having a particularly good year for profits. They were under quite a lot of pressure, so they split their operations to try and allow both functions of the business to work a little bit more independently. Ferrero took over Thornton's in 2015 with a £125 million takeover. There's been some near misses as well. So Hershey rejected a bid from Mondelez. So we talk about those big 4, and we talk about the big 4 trying to get bigger. There's an example there where probably the 5th company, Hershey's, rejected a bid of £18 billion from Mondelez. That was only in 2016. So Mondelez, not content with owning Cadbury's and being one of the biggest 4 chocolate companies in the world, decided they wanted to get a little bit bigger. We've also got Ferrero purchasing Nestle's US confectionery business in 2018. I think that one happened in January for $2.1 billion. So loads of examples of takeovers. You don't need to remember them all. You don't need to remember the dates and stuff like that and how much they cost. Like I say, if they're an example in the extract, then it will have the information in there. But wouldn't hurt to be able to bring in another example maybe, if you can. The other thing we have to have a look at is influences on the market. So when it comes to influences in the market, there's a couple of main areas that I think are worth considering. Obviously, global business, you study a lot of emerging economies and developed economies and the difference between them. And there's a massive difference between those 2 types of economy in terms of how much chocolate they eat. The emerging economies are eating more chocolate. There is significantly less consumption of chocolate at the moment, but it is growing at a higher rate, and these emerging economies tend to have massive populations, so therefore they have massive potential. They've also got the benefit of growing income, and with growing income becomes more spending on items you would consider to be a bit more of a luxury, and chocolate definitely is a luxury product. Even the sort of standard chocolate is considered, it's a non-essential good basically. So there's going to be people who now have access to more money who are going to be buying more chocolate. So the potential for growth, China's an obvious example. The market value for China has doubled since 2009, more than doubled in fact, and is forecast to grow as well. It's not growing at quite the same rate as it has in the past, but obviously you know how big China is, you know how many people there are there. The population is absolutely huge. So if you can become the market leader in China and it continues to grow, you're in the money basically. Mondelez trying to get on top of that by investing millions into the Chinese market. They brought out their Milka products. I think they've spent something like $100 million trying to push that into the Chinese market. The developed economies, so the UK and other sort of Western economies, they're eating less chocolate. And we'll come into a little bit about this in the next slide. But one of the reasons for this is, because our economies aren't growing at the same rate. So maybe people have a little bit less disposable income, and incomes aren't growing at a really high rate, while prices are rising. So we're spending a little bit less on it because it's a non-essential good. But also, we're a little bit more aware, our consumers are a bit more aware of health risks. So that's obviously having a big factor, which leads us very nicely onto the next slide, which is about social trends. So consumers are moving, especially in the West, in the developed economies, consumers are moving more towards healthy eating habits. And there's two main areas that have pushed this. And one is the attitudes towards sugar consumption, and people are aware of the risks of sugar and having too much sugar in your diet. And also, these are fairly well linked, but the growing obesity crisis as well. So we want to try, and our consumers are trying to make themselves a little bit healthier. And so therefore, they cut out products that are perceived to be bad for you. So chocolate would be one of those. Not just consumers are moving away from it, but I think businesses are well aware of it, and governments are also playing their part as well by trying to encourage people to be in better health. It obviously saves them money in terms of the health service, but it also makes for a happier society, hopefully. It depends. Some people might argue they're pretty happy when they've got chocolate. The last thing I want to have a look at with influences on the market is corporate social responsibility. So businesses obviously have their legal responsibilities depending on their country of operations to meet. Corporate social responsibility is where a business tends to go beyond their legal requirement to consider social, ethical, and environmental factors in their operations. It tends to be something they publicize as well. So a business that is quite high on CSR, they're going to make that a pretty big part of their marketing. It's going to be something that's going to show them off as a company that cares about society, cares about ethics, cares about the environment. One of the main benefits of this is it's going to give them enhanced reputation, potentially a unique selling point. If other businesses in their market aren't doing it, they can become the ethical retailer. It's not a chocolate example, but a pretty prominent example of this would be H&M, who've tried to position themselves as the ethical clothing retailer with the sourcing of the materials for their clothes, etc. We also have to consider human resources, and the main area in which this is a factor is in the supply chain. So a lot of this information comes from the Business Review article. In 2013, an estimated 1.42 million children were working in cocoa production in the Ivory Coast, and that's just in the Ivory Coast, and 37.8% of these children were employed in hazardous conditions. So the question must be asked, could the leading companies in the global confectionery market guarantee that there is no use of child labour in production of cocoa beans that they are then using for their products? It's something that has a massive negative impact on their reputation if it's discovered that that's the case. I don't think consumers in the developed economies want to purchase goods where they know that the child labour has been used in production. And so therefore the big four companies that we mentioned earlier, Mondelez, Nestle, Mars and Ferrero and others, have worked incredibly hard to try and fix this. And they've put a lot of different things in place to try and make sure that they can try and make their supply chain a little bit more ethical. So I'm only going to give one example. There are plenty of others. A lot of the companies have their own. I think it's Cadbury's, I think it's Mondelez that have started their own version of this. But I think it says in here, the big four have been part of fair trade, though Mondelez has recently switched in favour of their own developed cocoa life standard. I should have just read my slide rather than trying to ad-lib. Clearly I'm not experienced enough at this whole YouTubing thing to just make things up on the spot when it's written down right in front of me. So fair trade is the most prominent one. You'll see the fair trade logo, you can see it on the screen there. That is quite commonly on packaging. If you see it on the packaging, then you know that the producer of the chocolate has worked with fair trade. And one of the key areas of fair trade for human resources is that it provides a minimum price per tonne of £1,600. So the way it works is basically the market price for cocoa is determined largely by supply and demand. So if there's a lot of demand, then the farmers they can increase their prices and therefore make more money from selling their cocoa. When demand isn't at its highest, or there's a lot of supply or there's excess supply, then the market price for cocoa is going to drop. And if it drops too low, then they're not going to have a fair wage in terms of being able to afford a certain quality of life. So the idea behind fair trade is that they set this minimum price per tonne of £1,600. If the market price is higher, if the market price, for example, is based on supply and demand £1,800, then the farmers will get £1,800. It's this minimum price ensures that if the market price drops below £1,600, that the farmers still get paid £1,600. So what it effectively does, it guarantees them at least that consistent an income and they would consider to be a fair wage, so that they're able to try and further their community, further their economy. So fair trade's all about setting standards, and they certify products and ingredients. They have their independent checks. If it's got the fair trade symbol on, then you can be assured that the farmers who farmed the cocoa, wherever that is, have been paid that fair wage, basically. So we also that's all I'm going to go into with that. There's other examples of that. There's other examples of initiatives that these businesses have put forward that you'll be able to find online. For now, we're going to have a look at the competitive environment. So, as I mentioned earlier, the big difference here is the difference in the mass market and the niche market. So in the mass market, the big area of competition is from the big four. They've got a massive hold. We've talked about the market share. They've got a massive hold on the mass market, and this is due to they've got first of all, they've got massive production scale, and the more they produce, the more they're able to benefit from things like economies of scale. So they've got specialized production. They've got the ability to buy in bulk. They've got that sort of purchasing power. They're going to have economies of scale, and the key thing with economies of scale is that allows them to reduce their unit costs, which then allows them to either reduce their prices potentially or just increase profit margins and make more money per item. So they have that. So it's going to be difficult for a new business to try and attract the mass market and compete on a price basis. But also these four companies have globally recognized brands. I think someone who doesn't even eat chocolate will recognize the brands of Cadbury's, Nestle, Mars, Ferrero, etc. and all of their other brands. They obviously have tons of different products. So you can't compete on a price basis. You can't compete on a brand basis. So in the mass market, it's very, very difficult. And this is a link to Porter's Five Forces when we talk about threat of new entrants. Those four companies in the mass market are pretty secure. So new entrants to the chocolate market tend to find it a bit easier to target a niche market. So there's a few areas where there can be a niche, such as health conscious. You can get these protein bars for people who want extra protein, or maybe they go to the gym and things like that. And that's obviously a social trend towards people trying to be a bit healthier. So there's the niche market of that. I don't think many of the big four companies have started to try and target that market yet. We've also got the dietary requirements, so vegan, gluten-free, dairy-free. The products obviously are going to cost more money because they're going to be more expensive to produce, and smaller businesses are going to find it easier to target those markets. And then we've got luxury chocolate as well. I've given an example on this slide there. You can see a picture of Hotel Chocolat. Chocolat? Is it just chocolate, but you just doesn't have the E, so you just say it differently? Sounds a bit more posh, I think, and I guess that's the point. It probably doesn't come across very well in a Geordie accent. But luxury chocolate, they've targeted a niche market. They've targeted luxury, high price, which kind of cuts off the fact that they're not going to have the same level of production costs. They're going to have higher unit costs. You would expect higher unit costs with a luxury product anyway because they're more expensive to produce. Maybe higher quality materials and stuff like that. They've managed to do that very successfully. They've made significant profits. You can have a little bit of a research. If you search a Hotel Chocolat, you'll be able to find, or chocolate, I don't know how to say it. Not a great one for pronunciation, this video. You'll be able to find some examples of, you'll see some data about how much their profits have grown over the last few years and how much they've grown in terms of their expansion across the UK. So have a look for some of those stats. I haven't got them to hand. I can't give you everything after all, can I? The last thing we're going to have a little bit of a look at is marketing and promotion. So the first thing to consider is ethical considerations. So a lot of chocolate adverts are based around encouraging children to purchase chocolate. So you see these adverts where the clear advertising tag is to try and get kids to see these children on the adverts or people looking really happy and or funny and silly eating chocolate, and the idea being that if you see someone looking really happy eating chocolate, you're going to want some chocolate as well because you're going to want to be that happy. And kids, you know what kids are like. You look at some examples here. We've got the buttons and the Freddo with the little cartoons on. 20p for a Freddo. I don't even think that's accurate anymore. I remember when it used to be 10p. I bet you every business teacher has made a comment about that this year, talking about when Freddos used to be 10p. You've got the Wonka range. Nestle brought out a Wonka range based around the Willy Wonka and the Chocolate Factory movies, or Charlie and the Chocolate Factory. I can't remember which one was which. That's a children's movie, so the products are supposed to be a little bit silly. They're supposed to be a little bit fun, so they're going to be for children. And then you got the Milky Bar Kid. I think the Milky Bar Kid probably predates the year 13 students who will be doing this paper. You might recognise him. I think there was a rumour on Twitter that he died, actually. I don't think he did, but I think I saw that on Twitter. So we've got to consider how ethical this is. It does contribute to problems such as child obesity, for example. There's a huge issue in media. I think it's something government are taking quite seriously, child obesity. So you might see that maybe advertising regulations change a little bit about chocolate over the next few years. I'm going to mention something a little bit about that in about 2 slides time on the last slide. So I'll come back to that then. Another thing to consider is how viral the advertising campaigns can get. So there's some examples of chocolate adverts that have gone viral. Most prominently, the Cadbury's Gorilla that plays the drums with the Phil Collins song. One of my personal favourites is the M&M's one with the 2 M&M's. I think they're a little bit more adult in some of the humour, but I quite like those ones. You see them a lot of American sports and stuff like basketball. You see them. There's examples of where these adverts have gone viral, and obviously that has a massive impact on businesses. I think in the mock exam that we did, which was one of the 2 exams, there was a question about how the viral marketing had an impact on a business like Cadbury's, and I think it mentioned the Cadbury's Gorilla. It might have mentioned the Cadbury's eyebrow one. If I could play videos in my little live stream, then I would. The little eyebrow one. You can go on YouTube after you finish watching this video. You can go and search for Cadbury's eyebrow advert and have a look at that. It's a little bit weird. The last thing I mentioned this earlier is there are changes to the market mix. When we talk about marketing and promotion, we need to remember that marketing is not just advertising. Marketing is the 4 Ps. So product, price, place, and promotion. So I'm going to focus on 2 of these because there's been quite significant changes, and I didn't really know where else in my presentation to put it, so I've put it here. First of all, with the product, it's well publicised that the size of chocolate bars has changed. They're getting smaller. There's a couple of factors for this. One is that people are consuming less chocolate, so if they feel like they're getting ripped off because they don't want a whole chocolate bar, if businesses make them a little bit smaller, they feel like it's a little bit more acceptable. But one other factor for this is that producers have agreed with government that single bars should have a maximum of 250 calories. Now, I think we've seen the sugar tax come in with soft drinks and fizzy drinks, where the prices had to go up because they were being charged tax on for the sugary content. I wonder if and this is an idea I picked up from that Business Review article, I wonder if the chocolate producers, feared that something like that might happen to them, and so therefore they were a little bit more proactive and tried to reach an agreement with government before the government reacted to maybe the childhood obesity crisis and imposed maybe an increased tax or something like that. So they had a little bit more control over it. So they were a bit more proactive, perhaps. I don't know that for certain. I wasn't part of those conversations, obviously. However, what it has done, it probably hasn't had the same impact because the chocolate bars are smaller, yeah. We know that. But what it has then led to is there's more products such as sharing bags, duo bars, multi-packs. They've become much more popular. So although they're making the product smaller, they're selling more of them, and they're selling them in different ways to try and get around it. So the products have developed a little bit as well. The price is just one sort of line about the price. While the size of chocolate bars have shrunk, prices have remained fairly consistent and actually increased in some examples. So just because obviously, if a chocolate bar becomes smaller, maybe if it drops 5 grams, that's 5 grams of raw materials that aren't being used. So therefore, it's fair to assume that the cost of manufacture for the producers is smaller. So therefore, if they maintain the same price, they would increase profit margins, because if unit costs are smaller and the selling price is the same, they're going to have increased profitability on that one unit. But it still seems like they're putting their prices up as well. Some big examples of this, by the way, I think we were all outraged by what happened to Toblerone. I was getting Toblerones for every Christmas for about 15 years, and I never thought I liked them until about 2 years ago when I realised how great Toblerones are. I think I just actually tried one. I don't even know why I hadn't bothered for the previous years. I must have not liked it when I was about 13 and decided never to go back. And then they cut most of it out. Like the triangles are barely even triangles anymore. They're not thick at all. So I think they shed something like a fifth of the weight. I think Terry's Chocolate Orange lost a couple of slices. Mars bars have got smaller. There's tons of examples of these. I think the only one that has gone the other direction is a Kit Kat. Kit Kats have got heavier. So there's just some context there. You can bring that in. Maybe there's going to be an example of that in the case study. The last slide I want to give you is, I had one student say to me that my videos end very abruptly. And so I would like to counter that by putting some last minute reminders on the last slide. So my sort of big 4 points. Remember your timing. There's a lot of essay questions. 1 hour on each section. Just make sure you're focused on that. If you go in and lose yourself in the questions and don't consider the timing, you can find yourself running out of time. And the last thing you want to do is miss out on essay. One of them is going to require you to use numeric information. Likely to be the last 20 marker, but it might be another question as well. You will know this because it will start with using the data and extract, and then whatever extract it is. So just make sure if you come out of that exam paper and you haven't done a single calculation, one of those questions you're going to get less than half marks on. So just make sure that you've come out and you've used some numeric data. You should be able to do it. You're A Level Business students. You're doing your third paper now. You should be used to it, and you should be prepared for it. Like I said earlier, have a little bit of a preparation on ratio analysis and investment appraisal. But also, make sure you know your stuff about decision trees and critical path analysis as well. Because there's no 4 marker, so there's not going to be a calculation one where you're going to get 4 marks for calculating it. But there could be a question about the impact of it or something like that, which might require some calculation. So just make sure you don't neglect those things. I think calculations wise, they've been fairly forgiving so far. So just make sure you're prepared that they might be a little bit more tricky in this paper 3. Make sure you read the question. I know that goes without saying, but say for example, if it's a 20 marker and it talks about which is likely to increase profits, your answer has to be about which option is more likely to increase profits. It can't just be which one is better. The question is which one's more likely to increase profits. So just make sure you read the question fully, carefully, and make sure you answer the question clearly, both in the points that you make and the conclusion. Your paragraph should start something like, one positive impact of whatever on this business is. And then your conclusion should be, in conclusion, I believe that the impact is good, bad, small, large, no impact, huge impact, whatever your answer is. Make sure you use the words of the question. Make it really clear to the examiner that you understand what the question's asking you for and you answer it clearly. And lastly, just make sure you leave it all in the exam hall. Don't come out with any regrets. Do the very, very best. You've worked really, really... I'm sort of saying this more to my students. I don't know how hard the rest of you have worked. But my students have worked really, really hard over the last 2 years. And this is the last 2 hours of A Level Business. So make sure you just leave it all in there. And then you never have to do any more business studies work for me ever again. So enjoy it. I hope that you've enjoyed the course that you've studied, whether that's with me or with someone else. I hope my students have enjoyed the time that we've spent together. I know I have, and I'll miss them a lot. So good luck to everyone doing the paper tomorrow. Please do let me know how it goes. And obviously, I'm posting this a bit early. I'm probably going to post this Wednesday morning. I'm recording it Tuesday night, but I'll probably post it Wednesday morning because it's already 10:30. So we've got quite a bit of time between now and the exam on Monday. The last video I put on the Friday and the exam was the Monday, and it got something like 2,000 views, which was quite astounding. So if you have any questions or any comments or anything in particular that you want me to go through, I've probably got some time to do a few little videos. So ask in the comments or ask me on Twitter. My Twitter is at Mr. J Goodrich, all one word. You'll be able to find me. Ask me if you've got any questions. But other than that, I'm not going to say good luck again because I don't think luck's got really much to do with it. if you've prepared, then you should be able to answer the questions that you get given. So instead, I would say have fun. And that's how I'm going to end my video. Dan, I hope this ending was good enough for you.